So, Steve, welcome to the Health Path podcast. It's really nice to meet you finally.
Hi, Alex. Great to be with you.
Yeah, so I've been looking forward to this conversation. I got sent your book probably 2 or 3 months ago now, and it's right up my alley. It's incredibly inspiring. I think it touches on the theme of resilience, which is something that I talk about a lot from a physical health perspective. So I'm looking forward to kind of picking your brain and understanding a little bit more about this. And as a segue into that, are you happy just to maybe introduce yourself and sort of your background and what got you into what you do?
Okay, yeah, I'm a psychologist, a researcher and lecturer in a field called transpersonal psychology, which is really spiritual psychology. We look into the overlap between psychology and spirituality and the place where psychology meets spiritual traditions and spiritual practices. I'm also an author of books on psychology and spirituality, and also a poet.
Brilliant. Okay. And you obviously have your book, Extraordinary Awakenings, which introduces a term, essentially transformation through turmoil. So I guess my first couple of questions would be, how did the book come about, and what is this term? It's similar, I guess, in some ways to post-traumatic growth, which some of our listeners might be a little bit more familiar with. But I'd love to just sort of maybe get a definition of what we mean.
Transformation through turmoil is a more extreme and dramatic form of post-traumatic growth. My interest really came from an experience I had about 15 years ago. And it was when I was seriously ill, for fortunately the only time in my life so far. I was in hospital for I felt tremendously grateful just to be alive in this world, in this body, after a brush with mortality. But most of all, I felt this tremendous sense of appreciation for the people in my life, for all of the abilities, all of the functions, all of the things I normally take for granted or took for granted. So it changed my perspective, and I thought, wow, a brush with mortality really teaches you the value of life. It was as if a veil had fallen away, and I was seeing things as they really were. I was sort of appreciating life as it really is, appreciating it for the gift it actually is. So that encouraged me to look for other examples in similar situations. I mean, yeah, I should say that the initial kind of intensity of that experience faded away, but it left something behind. It left a kind of ongoing sense of appreciation, an ongoing sense of well-being. So then I discovered the term post-traumatic growth, which I guess that captures some elements of my experience. But I began to look into the effects of, brushes with mortality, diagnoses of cancer, other serious illnesses, and also things like bereavement, also, addiction, like recovery from addiction. I found out that all of these situations can induce life-changing transformational experiences, which I called transformation through turmoil.
Beautiful. And I think it really kind of resonates, and it aligns with some of the reading I've read around, I guess, kind of spiritual awakenings, which have some degree of similarity, I would say, there as well. Some of these incredibly stressful, strenuous experiences that have shifted people's perspective on life, ultimately. I mean, you talk in your book around incarceration and war being two other examples.
That's right. It is, I guess it's equivalent to spiritual awakening in that it completely changes a person's perspective on reality. It completely changes the way they live. But usually it occurs outside any spiritual context. It occurs in the midst of everyday life to people who would not consider themselves religious or spiritual. And imprisonment was one situation where I found that transformation through turmoil is quite common. Surprisingly common, actually. I didn't expect it to be so common. I had to devote 2 chapters to it because it was I had so many examples of people who underwent transformation in prison. In the UK, actually, there's an organization called the Prison Phoenix Trust, which supports and encourages spiritual growth in in prison. So they have a newsletter where prisoners describe their experiences. And it's not uncommon for people to send in experiences of, shift in perspective and a shift in their behavior. Sometimes it's a shift into a sense of empathy for other people, which they never had before, a sense of compassion and, or a desire to make amends, or just a shift in perception where, the world becomes more real. Things seem to look more fresh, more energetic, more vivid. And I guess, I pondered over why prison is such a fertile environment for transformation. I mean, obviously, it's still only a minority of prisoners undergo this experience, but quite a significant number. Probably, in comparison to the rest of the population, in other situations, it's quite a very significant trigger of transformation. And one reason is because in prison, people are forced to self-reflect. Some people, are willing to reflect on their own experiences, reflect on their own personality. And in prison, there's a lot of solitude, a lot of inactivity. So you have that opportunity to reflect if you want to take it, to go into yourself, to explore your own mind, your own behavior. People don't normally get the chance to do that in ordinary life because we're so active all the time. But also, probably most importantly, in prison, you're forced to let go. All of the things that define you as a person are outside the prison walls. They're on the other side. The roles that you have in society, your possessions, your relationships, your sense of status, and so on. All of these things are out there. So inside, you have nothing. You have to let go of all of the things which define you as a person. And that's a painful experience. That's probably one of the reasons why prison is a punishment. Right. But for some people, letting go of all of these attachments, which give us a sense of identity, that can be a liberating experience because it allows something deeper to emerge, a deeper kind of identity to emerge, a kind of authentic self, which people were never aware of before.
Yeah, and I want to come back to this concept of sort of the authentic self in a little bit, because it reminds me of one of the conclusions in the book around sort of, you discuss human evolution and the way it may be aligned with some of this. But before we sort of explore that side of things, you've just touched on one of the, I guess, the key questions that comes from the book, which is really around why does it occur? And you've just mentioned there kind of the, for one of the better way of putting it, kind of the attachment loss. We lose our identity in certain ways, our role, our responsibilities, especially if we're now in prison. So there's that, but you also mentioned this concept around ego dissolution being potentially another mechanism.
That's right. I mean, as we live our lives, we build up a sense of identity. As children, obviously we have an identity, but our adult identity, is built up slowly through the roles that we play, through our beliefs about the world, through our relationships with other people, our ambitions in life, our possessions. All of these things help to build up a sense of identity. And it can be, it's very useful to have a strong sense of identity. It can enable you to function well in your career and in your relationships and in the world in general. But the problem is when your identity is made up of all of these external things, it kind of covers over your authentic self. There's something, you lose something by building up this strong sense of identity. But when people go through intense turmoil, when they go through a long period of loss, whether it happens through, divorce, unemployment, whether it happens through bereavement, a diagnosis of cancer, or maybe a long period of depression or addiction, all of these things slowly fall away, the things that define you. So you lose your status, your roles, possessions, maybe, relationships, hopes, beliefs, all of these things slowly fade away. And that's why these experiences can be very, very painful, because, you strip yourself down of all the things that you thought were you. But that, just as we mentioned in the context of prison, that can be a liberating experience as well. When people lose these attachments, they can experience ego dissolution, which you mentioned. And that means that all of our attachments are the building blocks of the ego. So when these attachments fall away, when you lose your roles, your possessions, your status, your success, and so on, the ego itself can collapse, just like a house collapses when you take away a certain number of bricks. So the ego collapses. And again, that's often a painful experience. But in a certain number of people, there seems to be a kind of latent higher self, which is waiting to emerge. A kind of, if you want to speak in spiritual terms, a spiritually awakened self, which is there. It's fully formed, just waiting for the opportunity to emerge, like a chick waiting to hatch from an egg. So when the ego dissolves away, this latent or dormant spiritual self emerges and takes over, becomes established as a person's new identity. And that's why people in my book, whether it's through bereavement or incarceration or whatever, they talked about feeling as if they were completely different people, a different person living in the same body. And there were lots of radical changes. People experience a sudden disappearance of physical conditions that had plagued them for a long time, a sudden disappearance of addiction, and lots of, they often made radical changes in their lives, like changes to their careers, changes to their relationships. So it was a very deep-rooted shift of identity which took place.
And it fascinated me how differently that happened. So although you talk about two key sort of mechanisms in regards to ego dissolution and sort of a loss of identity or a loss of the things that we're attaching to in day-to-day life, sort of when and how that happened in each of the numerous kind of case stories that you provide in the book seems to be different. I think it was Eve, who was an alcoholic, and essentially seemed to just one day, for no sort of noticeable reason, just suddenly transform and not be able to really even identify herself in a mirror. Whereas for others, there was, witnessing the loss of their child, for example, and there was a very acute, immediate experience that seemed to initiate things. So I just found that really interesting. There were so many different routes into this.
That's right. The process was slightly different. It could be very different in different cases. But I think essentially the principles were the same in every case. Like, for example, in some people, it could be a very gradual process. It could happen over a number of years. I spoke to a soldier called David who was he was in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he experienced the death of his colleagues and came close to death himself. And so he had a series of traumatic experiences as a soldier, which slowly seemed to dissolve his ego, slowly sort of broke down his attachments until eventually it came to a point where, he broke down. But that happened over a number of years. Whereas for other people, it was an immediate single experience, like bereavement, for example, which suddenly broke them down. But in the case of somebody like Eve, who you just mentioned, for her, it was probably an incremental process over a number of years. She was a severe alcoholic for 29 years, and eventually, like a lot of addicts, she lost everything over that period of time. She sort of broke down her relationships. She lost her self-respect. She couldn't hold down her job. Eventually, she was homeless. Left with absolutely nothing. And she actually planned to commit suicide. She actually did attempt suicide. I think for her, that was the culmination. That was the point where she broke down when she attempted suicide. Probably something to do with the act of just giving up and deciding that was the end. There was nowhere else to go. When she realized there was nowhere else to go, she couldn't continue in that way. She couldn't stop drinking, so she felt she had no option apart from to kill herself. But somehow the act of doing that seemed to finally trigger that transformation. That long process of loss seemed to finally end in that point of transformation. And as you say, in that moment, she literally became a different person. And one facet of that was that her addiction suddenly disappeared. She had no more craving for alcohol from that moment. And I call that in the book addiction release. The moment when it's obviously very uncommon. Most addicts have to struggle for a long time on a day-to-day basis to keep themselves free, keep themselves sober. But for a certain minority of people, they seem to spontaneously let go of craving, and and it's no longer a struggle for them to stay sober. They just are a different person. So the addiction has fallen away with the person who died, the ego that died. So their new self doesn't carry any addiction.
Mm. And I think what you've sort of discussed there is probably a good way to consider the concept of resilience, because I remember one paper using the analogy of just a rubber band. You can stretch the rubber band over many goes and it will start to lose that elasticity, or you can stretch it really hard and it will just snap then and there. And it sounds like through those stories that although for some it was progressive over almost 3 decades, and for others it was kind of instantaneous in one acute experience, there's just a, would you say, kind of like a threshold where when we've stepped over that, there is this transformation?
Yeah, there does seem to be a final point. You could say it's a final point of loss where the ego dissolves away. I guess in AA circles they call this rock bottom, the point of no return, the point where you've lost everything, and you can either maybe die through your addiction, or you can transform. So yeah, there does seem to be a single point of transformation which occurs at a certain point of intense loss or intense stress. Sometimes it wasn't really connected to loss so much as intense stress. It's a bit like when people go through intensely stressful experiences, it's like an earthquake that can suddenly break down their sense of identity, rather than it happening over a long period. And it's also connected to people's attitude towards it. A lot of people, when they face turmoil and trauma, naturally try to repress it or divert themselves from it, which is entirely natural because we always want to avoid pain and discomfort. But I found that transformation was more likely to occur when people acknowledged and accepted their situation. Often transformation occurred in a moment of acceptance, or in a moment of surrender, you could say. For example, one guy I interviewed, he found that transformation occurred. He was also an alcoholic, and he started to go through the AA process, and he got to the point where you hand over your problem to a higher power. You say, I can't deal with this, it's too big for me, so I'm going to hand it over. And he experienced transformation at the moment of handing it over, because it's a kind of letting go of his problem. And another guy who was seriously disabled, he became disabled after he fell onto a rocky riverbed and broke his spine. But he was in intense turmoil for a long period, until he heard a voice in his head. He just heard a voice in his head say, why are you resisting this? Why are you hanging on? Just let go, just let go. And he just made a mental attention to kind of acknowledge his situation and just to accept it rather than resisting it. And that was when his transformation occurred.
Beautiful. Yeah, there's definitely a theme there in various areas. This idea of surrender and acceptance comes up in different sort of kind of areas of science almost, ultimately, as well. But going back to what you mentioned earlier around, there seems to be a latent higher self in a lot of the people that you interviewed, and perhaps all of us potentially. And then you kind of use that within one of your, I guess, concluding sort of thoughts or chapters around human evolution, and how there might be a connection between these transformations through turmoil in these cases and what's happening maybe within the collective, or however you want to frame it. So can you just kind of expand on that? Because I thought it was such an interesting way of thinking about it.
This new self which people experience, it seems to be a higher functioning self. I don't like hierarchies, but it does seem to function in a much better way than the ordinary human state. People's relationships are more intimate and more authentic. They perceive reality in a more intense way. The world looks more real to them, more beautiful. They're more open to their experiences, and they seem to be free of anxiety and worry. So in every way, it seems to be a shift up to a higher state. Also in the sense that people have a kind of a wider sense of identity They don't think in terms of group identity. They just sort of feel a sense of identification with human beings in general, no matter, irrespective of things like nationality or ethnicity, all of those kind of group labels. So the fact that it's a shift up into a higher state suggests that there's something evolutionary about it, and that it may be something which the human race is collectively moving towards. And if you want to think in terms of evolution, evolution right from the beginning, it's been partly about the physical transformation of moving into more complexity, more variation. Life forms become more varied and more complex. But there's also an inward dimension. As at the same time as becoming more complex physically, life forms become more conscious, more sentient. They have more of an inner life. And that's a trajectory from the beginnings of evolution until now, this increase in awareness, an increase in sentience. So if you compare human beings to an amoeba, which is the simplest life form, you can see that difference. If you compare human beings to, say, insects, you can also see that difference in sentience and awareness. So this state, which the shifters, as I call the people in my book, experience, is a further, is a continuation of that process. It's a shift into a state of higher awareness, more expansive, more intense awareness. So in that sense, it seems to be a continuation of this process of expansion of consciousness, which has been a part of evolution from the beginning. So that's why I think there is a connection to evolution.
And I guess, it's interesting that it comes at this point in time as well, when we need it like never before, ultimately. I think you mentioned in your book that these shifters sort of have a deeper connection, not just with themselves, not just with others, but with, with nature, with the planets, with essentially all relationships. So yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's one aspect of their transformation is that they feel more connected to nature. And nature seems more alive. People often remark about that, about how the natural world around them just seemed more beautiful and more real. It was as if scales had fallen away from their eyes and they could really see things as they were. So they felt this new sense of the kind of the beauty and the sacredness of nature and connection to nature. And obviously that brings a completely different attitude to the environment. It brings a sense of respect, a sense of concern, a sense of responsibility. It's the absence of these things which has led to our present environmental crises, seeing nature as a supply of resources to exploit and abuse. But, in this, if you see nature as sacred and alive, you can't exploit and abuse the natural world in the same way. So in that sense, a shift into that awareness could help and is probably necessary, essential for our survival, a new relationship to nature, a new awareness of nature.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a beautiful way to think about it. And you talk about in your book also sort of like a 4-step process to responding to challenges. So I think obviously from a practical perspective, the lessons you've learned by interviewing these sort of shifters, as you call them, are there some takeaways for our listeners that would be helpful for any future challenges that they might face?
That's what I wanted to find out. I mean, first of all, I wanted to find out why people undergo this transformation, and also why just some people undergo this transformation, because we all go through turmoil and trauma in our lives. We will all go through intense trauma at some point in our lives, but only a small minority of people seem to undergo this transformation. So I wanted to understand, what is it that differentiates people who go through this transformation from those who don't? And I found that it was partly about, or largely about, their attitude towards their predicament. It was to do with things like acknowledgement, acceptance, rather than avoidance. So, I mean, another point is that we don't have to go through suffering to undergo spiritual development, or to even undergo spiritual awakening. You can apply those principles to our own spiritual development in a situation which doesn't involve suffering. So that's why I try to identify the principles of their transformations and apply them to our own development. So the first stage is simply acknowledgement. So that means that, facing up to the reality of the situation rather than diverting yourself from it. Probably a good example is a diagnosis of serious illness. If you're diagnosed with cancer, for example, a part of you doesn't want to face up to it. It's such a terrible prospect. It may seem a terrible prospect. So obviously you don't want to think about it. You want to divert yourself from the reality, or you want to maybe delude yourself that it's not as serious as it really is. But that doesn't work, in terms of transformation. You have to face up to the reality, and even the, in all of the negativity that may involve. So that's the first stage, not accepting, but just acknowledging it, just facing up to it. And then the second stage is going into yourself, just stepping into your own being and looking at the feelings that it produces in you. If you're diagnosed with cancer, or if you face any other situation of turmoil and trauma, it's going to trigger certain feelings, certain negative feelings inside you. And again, there's an impulse to avoid those feelings, to divert yourself from them. But it's very important to just go inside and acknowledge them. And also, to explore your own being. And that's something which a lot of people find quite difficult, because in our everyday lives, we spend so much time focused outside that we don't actually spend much time exploring our own being. But we have to take that step inside ourselves. And first of all, acknowledge the negative feelings we have, and to explore our own being and explore our reactions to the situation and to the feelings that we have. One reason why that's important is because once you observe your own feelings or your thoughts, there's immediately a distance between you and those thoughts. If you can sort of stand back and just watch them, there's a space between you and your feelings. And you begin to realize that you are not your feelings. You are the person who observes those feelings. So there's immediately a kind of space, a kind of separateness between them. And that means that somehow those feelings or thoughts don't become as painful. Once you are aware of this distance between you and them, they seem somehow softer, somehow less painful. So there's two steps there. The first step is acknowledging the predicament. The second step is acknowledging the feelings that the predicament produces. The third step is exploring your own being, exploring the reactions you have to the feelings and thoughts. And the fourth stage is probably the most important one, and that is acceptance. That means opening yourself completely to the predicament and to the feelings that you have, embracing the situation and letting go of any resistance, surrendering to the situation, just, an attitude of complete openness to the situation, letting go of any duality between you and the situation, any conflict, any resistance. And that seems to harness the transformational power of the predicament. Every situation of crisis or trauma has a certain degree of transformational potential, and an attitude of acceptance seems to harness that potential.
Brilliant. And that's a theme that's come up, I think, a few times in the podcast, speaking to different experts in different fields. And there's definitely, I think, a felt sense about this, the idea that transformation is expansive, and that dis-ease and that friction is very much about withdrawing. It just feels like intuitively that it kind of makes sense that that's energetically what's kind of going on there.
That's right. I mean, if you resist any situation, it creates conflict. There's a duality between you and the reality of your situation, of your life. And also to sustain resistance, it takes quite a lot of energy, so that kind of drains away your vitality. But when you let go of resistance, on the one hand, there's a sudden freeing of energy. All the energy of resistance is suddenly released. But also, there's no longer a conflict or a duality between you and the reality of your life. There's a sense of openness, a sense of embracing reality. And that's very, very powerful, and that in itself can be transformational.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really beautiful way of thinking about it, and hopefully provides people, kind of framework that they can take away with them for any sort of moment of turmoil or trauma.
Yeah, it applies to every aspect of life, actually. Acceptance can be used in any area of our lives, any situation, any part of our lives which is causing some conflict, some frustration, or some resistance. Any chore or responsibility in your life that you feel resistance to, you can transmute that resistance into acceptance, and you'll immediately feel, a new sense of ease and a new sense of well-being. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't need to change your life. We all have certain aspects of our lives that need to be improved, but often an attitude of acknowledgement and acceptance is the beginning of change. It enables you to see what really needs to be changed in your life.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like there's potentially a connection between sort of the acceptance and what you're talking about, sort of being the observer of thoughts, or the observer of life almost, ultimately, and that objectivity can shift perspective and lead to maybe some solutions and ways to change while still
Absolutely.
accept. Would you kind of say that there's a connection there?
Definitely, yeah. There's a real issue when we are identified with our feelings and thoughts. I found there was a soldier I spoke to who suffered PTSD. He was actually in the Falklands War back in the 1980s. And for the 10 years after the war, he was in a terrible state because of his PTSD. He couldn't work, and he was involved in substance abuse, and his relationships broke down. He just couldn't function in everyday life. But somebody gave him a book about Buddhism. And he went to a Buddhist meditation group one evening, and he had just for a few seconds during the meditation, he felt a freedom. He felt that he was not his thoughts or feelings anymore. He was the observer of those thoughts and feelings. Just for a few seconds, he disidentified from his thoughts and feelings. And it made him realize that he was suffering because of his thoughts and feelings, not because of what had happened 10 years ago. It was his mind that was causing the suffering, which is, one of the main insights of Buddhism, that suffering is caused by the mind. So the simple act of disidentifying, stepping outside his own thought processes, was liberating. And I think it always is liberating. When we suffer from depression, it's often because of, the way our minds ruminate about negative events, or, the way our self-image is negatively affected by certain thought processes. So when you step back and, realize that you're the observer of your thoughts, you don't have to identify with them. It's tremendously liberating, and it gives you a sense of freedom. There's a sense of space between you and your thoughts. And that space seems to grow over time. The less you identify with your thoughts, the less thoughts can affect you. There's a kind of like a space between you and your thoughts, which grows and grows. And eventually you realize that you have a new identity. You have an identity as a kind of a witnessing, observing self, rather than a thinking self. And that's, that makes life much easier and much richer.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. And is there anything else that you would perhaps like to conclude with, Steve, or anything that we've left out that you would really like to share with our listeners?
One thing, well, two things really. One thing is that through doing the research in my book, I found that human beings are much more resilient than we normally assume. I found that, even people who were sort of lacking in self-confidence, people who didn't think they would be able to cope in certain situations, when it came down to it, when they were tested by life, they found that they had, amazing reserves of resilience inside them, that they were much stronger than they suspected. So I even found cases of, prisoners in the Soviet gulags in the 1950s, 1960s, who were living in incredibly terrible circumstances, were close to death from starvation, were treated really brutally, living in freezing conditions. When they were close to death through starvation or deprivation, they found a new kind of energy, a kind of inner radiance, which would emerge and sustain them and enable them to survive. And, I found that time and time again, I found that human beings are much more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. So it's made me personally realize that, when I am tested by life in the future, I will be able to cope with it. There will be reserves of resilience inside me, which will rise to the surface. And the other thing is that I'd like people to realize that there is a transformational potential in crises and trauma and challenges. So we don't need to be so afraid of these experiences, because there is a kind of a golden core inside them. I'm not saying that we should embrace and seek out, suffering, but when it arises, as it always does, we should be aware that it does help us to grow, and it can even lead us to transformation.
And would you say, just a question that comes to mind, would you say that if we were to take on that sort of framework and think about acknowledgement and acceptance and sort of embodiment, that we may at least potentially, how should I put this, be able to see that golden egg, that golden core at a future opportunity? Because, we've accessed what is required for us to transform in turmoil.
I think so. Yeah. I think once you have this experience to any degree, then you'll no longer be afraid or so afraid of suffering. You'll no longer avoid turmoil and trauma when they occur, because you'll be aware that, here's an opportunity, even though I'm going to go through some degree of pain, but there's also an opportunity to grow. So in the long term, that there will be some beneficial effect.
Okay, brilliant. Steve, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Where can people find out more about you, the work that you do? Where can they find the book? If you're happy just to share kind of some of those details, that'd be great.
The best place is my website, which is stephenmtaylor.com. That's Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com. And there you can find links to my books and also lots of articles and poems and other resources.
Brilliant. And is it a degree in transpersonal psychology that you do?
I teach at two places. I teach at Leeds Beckett University, where we have a master's degree in interdisciplinary psychology. So transpersonal psychology is one of the modules on that course. I also teach for an online organization called the Aleph Trust, and they have a master's degree in consciousness, spirituality, and transpersonal psychology.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so if anyone listening wants to check those out, please.
Yeah, you can go to my website. There are links on my website. Perfect.
Stephen, thank you so much. It's been a real honor, and I look forward to sharing this with everyone soon.
Thank you, Alex. I really enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you.